Reading 56. From the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2. Berlin, January 21st, 1945. Further notes on eyes. Answers to questions arising from the previous paper. 1. What is an eye? An eye is a definite personality in us, a small being with an intellectual, an emotional, and a moving part. You must understand that eyes are quite real people in us. On one occasion, O said, quote, "You all think that eyes are not real. You think they are theoretical. I assure you that they are quite real and live in the house of your own being and continually control you." End quote. He then quoted the parable of the house in disorder, in which there is no master and where each eye uses the telephone in the name of the master. 2. Is it not desirable to identify with eyes which seek the work? Do not these eyes become deputy steward, proceed to steward, and finally become real eye? It is not desirable to identify with anything, but I will let that pass. It is desirable to go with work eyes and listen to what they say, especially when one is in the power of negative eyes. By means of self-observation, through the work and what it teaches, a number of eyes become separated from the rest, and these form deputy steward. This development of consciousness through self-observation leads gradually to the higher stages of steward and master. If a person does not nourish work eyes, they become feeble and may even leave us forever. 3. Can our eyes be divided into groups of similar eyes with which most of us are familiar? Can they be dealt with as groups, or must each separate eye be sorted out and worked on individually? Yes, eyes are divided into different groups because they inhabit different subdivisions of centers. Eyes that occupy very small subdivisions of centers are very small eyes. They may be useful for life, but they cannot understand the work. For this reason, the work teaches that we must value the work and feel it as something distinct from life and greater than life, because through this emotional valuation, we are at once in the presence of bigger eyes. It is impossible for a long time to see eyes individually, but it is possible to see that one has a number of different personalities. These personalities are composed of many eyes, but they each constitute a definite group. As, for example, in my own case, I have a large number of eyes that belong to my medical personality. O once said, quote, "Try to see quite definite personalities in you. You have a social personality, a professional personality, a domestic personality, and so on. But each of these personalities is made up of a great number of small eyes." 4. Since eyes are represented in each center, can fidgeting be said to be done by an eye? And if so, does this also imply that habit is accompanied by intellectual and emotional fidgeting? Yes, certainly, fidgeting is done by an eye, that is chiefly in the small subdivisions of moving center. Yes, it can be accompanied by intellectual and emotional fidgeting. It may be a rather powerful eye, acting on 3 centers equally. This requires observation. Observation begins with noticing the different work of the 3 centers. If you notice that you are intellectually in a fidgeting, uncertain state, you may notice that you make certain movements and so on, but often Mere fidgeting is a small, automatic eye in the moving center. For instance, a person may be always scratching his head, and this sort of fidgeting may belong to a very small, practically automatic eye in the moving center, and not interfere with the work of the emotional or intellectual centers. We all have all kinds of mechanical tricks, even when we are deeply concentrating. 5. Are all eyes acquired? Yes, they are all acquired, and they are acquired in all sorts of ways. It is usually said that they are chiefly acquired through imitation and education, but they are all acquired because they belong to the personality, which is acquired. The work says that it may be true that there is a trace of real I in us, but that is all that it says. But real I is not acquired. It is already there as a possibility from our birth. We do not make real I. We seek to approach it. Then we know who we are. 6. Are there eyes in essence? No, it cannot be said that there are eyes in essence, although some eyes that we acquire are very close to essence. We have more essential eyes. On the other hand, we have eyes that are very far away from essence and that belong chiefly to false personality. If our personality were the expression of our essence and fitted in with it, so to speak, we might say that our eyes were all connected with essence, but this is not the case as we are at present. Through the pressure of education and environment, our personality may be very unlike our essence, and when this is the case, it is not unnatural to expect that we may have an unusual degree of inner disharmony. 7. Suppose a man or woman in their personality, suppose a man or woman has in their personality useful eyes such as hospitable eyes, helpful eyes, eyes which are skillful in handling tools, etc., but that they act to be seen of men. Suppose, after work on themselves, they were able to do the same things from themselves. Would those eyes become essential in them? We have all sorts of useful eyes acquired through our upbringing. You must remember that personality must be formed and may be formed better or worse. Good training is necessary for everyone, accompanied by good ordinary discipline. We all have to learn a trade or profession. We have to learn manners and so on. All this is acquired. The action of the work is such that it chooses those eyes that are useful and lifts them up, so to speak, so that they no longer act quite mechanically, but can be used deliberately, that is, consciously. The work makes a kind of ark in us, into which everything useful goes. We cannot do this ourselves. The action of the work does it and arranges everything in the right order. 8. A. Is essence the seed from which real I can grow? Yes, in a way. It is better to say that behind essence lies real I, and through the development of essence we contact real I. The object of this work is for us to become more real, to get rid of false, unreal eyes. This can only be done through inner sincerity and long observation, and through the influence of the work, acting on one over a long time, and the latter depends on struggling to keep the work alive in one over a long period. All this leads on to the development of essence, which puts us in contact with steward and real I. You must conceive steward and real I as being above us on a higher level, and as it were awaiting us, being as it were more internal, deeper, beneath the surface on which most of our psychic life takes place. Whether you call it a movement upwards or a movement inwards, it amounts to the same thing. All this work has to be done by ourselves. We are in the position of having lost our way and having to find the way back again. Everyone is created perfect, that is, with real I. But we descend into this world both literally and psychologically and lose our way. There is some reason for this, and one of the explanations of it is that we are created as self-developing organisms. It is an experiment. Every man and every woman is an experiment based on this idea, which must be constantly reflected upon, constantly held in mind. 8b. Is real I the individual limit of potential development which lies above every man, the shape he could become, different for everyone, or the same? Yes, it is the ultimate reality that we can attain. Behind real I lies God. But surely this question is a little formatory. Certainly everyone is an individual creation, and so real I can never be the same. The trouble is that we try to imitate other people, and it is just like a daffodil trying to become a tulip. There is not a single snowflake that is not quite different from another snowflake in its form of crystallization, although the general hexagonal pattern of the snow crystal is the same. 9. Is there any difference between eyes and inner consciousness? I can see no connection between these two factors in this question. Eyes are eyes, and inner consciousness is inner consciousness. If you mean by inner consciousness the power of self-observation, through this you can see eyes in yourself. But the question is like saying that if you have an electric torch in the dark and see a wall in front, is the wall the same as the torch? The work says that by true self-observation, we let a ray of light into ourselves. Through this ray of light, we may see a thing in us. But an eye is not the same as a ray of light. And of course, a ray of light does not mean physical light, but the light of consciousness, which it is the object of the work to increase beyond everything that you can imagine at present, so that you can see yourself at a glance and everything going on in every center. I will now comment on one or two observations that were made in the subgroups on points in the paper. 1. There was something said in the paper that I thought was very encouraging. If you really see a thing, even if you can't do anything with it, it will recede. This is quite right. And in seeing this, you catch a glimpse of what the work is about. You catch a glimpse of what self-observation is and why it is taught so strictly. The work says that self-observation is a method of change of being. This is a very important thing to understand, and it may take years before one catches a glimpse of its meaning. On all this depends inner separation. I ask you this question: how can you separate from anything in yourself unless you observe it? If you cannot see yourself at all and never observe what is acting through you at different times, if, in short, you take yourself as one, you cannot change. If you can only see what you did not do and never observe what you did, you are certainly very externally minded and have not awakened the power of observing I, or the inner sense that we are all given. We are given this inner sense so that we can fulfill our meaning as self-developing organisms. All inner development would be quite impossible if we had not this sense that is turned inwards towards our psychic life, but merely possessed 5 senses turned outwards. 2. Eyes are living but may be induced to die. Eyes are certainly living and are quite real entities. Whether they die or not is another question. The work merely teaches that if they are not nourished, they get weak. But if, like the shades of Hades, they drink your blood, they become alive and begin to speak. Eyes may be absent from you for a time and revisit you, but that is another question. But it applies especially to higher work eyes in oneself. Our ordinary eyes are constantly with us. You know, they are called the poor. 3. It would be interesting if we could discover what there is in one. One could have a most varied life, with most varied eyes, some quite valuable. Yes, this would mean having reached the level of balanced man, who can move freely about in himself, and in whom all different sides of himself are to some extent developed. He has no longer his center of gravity in one center, as have number 1, number 2, and number 3 men. For example, if I am very much identified with my life as a doctor, I shall not be able to move freely in myself, and will have only a very one-sided development. When you are identified with your professional side or your birth side or whatever it may be, you cannot become balanced man. I often think myself that one of the best phrases one can use in regard to understanding what balanced man means is to, quote, be able to see what it means not to be identified with your life, end quote. Your past life should not catch you always and hold you down. Here you all have something practical to work on for a long time. I will now comment on 2 further questions which have been sent in since the above was written. 10. Is an eye which passes straight into emotional center one which is so well known to intellectual center from habit that it no longer needs to pass to intellectual center first? This question is very formatory. I would simply say, do you really know about an eye so distinctly? But you must remember that some impressions fall on the emotional center, and this means that it is necessary to observe how the emotional center reacts in face of life without any self-observation. We have to employ the intellectual center to observe ourselves and not let an impression fall directly on the emotional center, without the moment of consciousness in which one sees where it is falling. Observing eye starts in the intellectual center, where our consciousness, broadly speaking, lies. It is a question of what you let through. You can take hold of a red-hot poker by accident and yet observe the reaction before it happens automatically. It is a question of instinctive center and the slight possible control of it, and the same applies to the emotional center. 11. How does an eye affect the emotional center direct? Can an impression pass directly to the emotional center without passing through intellectual center or the network of associations? Is a negative emotion invariably preceded by a thought? Is a negative emotion preceded by a thought? I would say that it is a question of attitude. If you have not yet seen how you react from attitude, which is mental to begin with, and accompanied by practically no thought, and yet is, then the impression will fall directly on the negative part of emotional center. Remember that the work teaches that our impressions come in through the intellectual center and then pass to the other centers. It is necessary to make a conscious point at the place where they come in. If you allow an impression to go right through, then it will follow its own habitual path. We will begin to check the effect of external impressions in the mental center, first of all. For instance, Need I, if I feel cold, shiver and complain? If I am more in control of myself, I need not react in that way unless I wish to. If I am not quite mechanical, the point of incoming impressions that fall upon the mind will be capable of a kind of selection so that they do not ring up automatically the same reactions. The point of the work is to make a conscious point at the place of incoming impressions, and this demands the power of observation so that one is separated from the continual effect of life coming in and reacting always in the same mechanical way. It is a marvelous thing to realize that one need not take a life event always in the same way. But for this to begin to take place, one has to be able to see the event and at the same time see one's mechanical reaction to it. When the work intervenes between these two things, the external event coming in through the senses and the mechanical reaction that would ordinarily take place, when there is this moment of conscious choice which the work seeks to establish in us, then we begin to understand what the work is about practically. This is called moving hydrogens 12 to the point of incoming impressions. This means also beginning to live more consciously in the midst of life.